welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. Today we are delighted to be speaking with Therese Turner-Jones of the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. Therese is the general manager of the Country Development Caribbean Group, which covers the Bahamas, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, and via the Caribbean Development Bank, CDB, the countries of the OECS, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which is quite a mouthful.
It's quite a mouthful. The department or the OECS?
Just all of the scope of what you do.
Absolutely, yeah.
So thank you so much for having us, and welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure.
So to get us started, just tell us a bit more about the IDB. We know IDB as an entity that gives country loans, but I'm sure there's so much more to the organization.
Right, so let me just spell out the acronym because a lot of people mix it up sometimes. So it's the Inter-American Development Bank Group, IDBG actually, because it involves the IDB, which deals with the sovereign side of the bank, which means that's the part of the bank that lends to governments. And then there's the IDB Invest, which is our private sector arm of the bank. And in between there, we have a small innovation group called IDB Lab, which lends to small to medium-sized entrepreneurs to do really creative, innovative kinds of projects that can be scaled up eventually. So we call it a lab because it's more like a testing. So you take a project, you experiment, maybe do a pilot, and then eventually you say, okay, this is ready to be replicated somewhere else, if not in this region, and somewhere else outside of the region. So those are the three pieces on the financing side. And then the bank has a big thrust, which is on the knowledge production side. And by that we mean all of the research, the publications, the advisory services of the bank, which is, in my mind, as important. So if you think about major changes that are going on anywhere, whether it's in public sector financial management, or whether it's in trying to solve how to deal with crime and violence, or in education, to stay at the cutting edge of knowledge means that you have to create knowledge as well. So you do research, you collect data, you come up with some hypotheses about how things should be done. So that's an important part of the bank's work as well.
Absolutely. So what would be, honing in on ICT, which is our focus, what is the bank's posture on ICT in the Caribbean region?
So as the general manager for the region, it's been a major avenue for reform because the Caribbean is probably one of the regions in Latin America and the Caribbean where our adaptation of technology and adoption of new ways of doing things digitally is lagging far behind other regions. And that's not unusual. We're a small region. We're very traditional ways of working. Even our production sectors are also very traditional, whether it's agriculture or tourism or financial services. So there hasn't been a lot of ICT, vast technological change that's affecting us in a way that you could say is game-changing.
Right.
So part of being alive in 2019,
right.
I think, is to move the mindset towards thinking about technology as an assist to helping us solve development challenges. So traditionally, we've been thinking about, if you take an area like education, for example, our region is very good at producing what I call elite outcomes in education.
Right.
But broadly, I would say, and research says for our region, that we're lagging behind in producing the kinds of students who can do high quality STEM work, for example, anything in science, technology, engineering, and so on. We produce very few people.
Right.
And we produce people who don't know how to think critically and solve problems in a way that is necessary for the modern work.
Yes.
We're definitely lagging behind in producing engineers, people who can code, people who know ICT in a way that makes it easy for an average business to say, pick up the phone and call someone to write a program for how to do their business differently. Right. So we need to invest in ICT. We also know that when we look at some of the metrics for how ready is the region for taking on more technology, I wish I brought the charts with me, but 3 countries are above the Latin American average, and 3 countries are below. Right. Unfortunately, Jamaica is one of those that's below.
No, right.
Bahamas, Trinidad, and Barbados are the 3 that are more ready. But that has to do with connectivity, broadband access, penetration, and so on.
Yes.
We have a lot of mobile telephones in the region. There's high mobile penetration, but in terms of connectivity, we're lagging behind. So I would say it has to be a big thrust. We have to keep pushing this digital transformation agenda in the Caribbean because there are many problems that can be solved, I think, better using technology.
Right.
There are many ways in which the government can function more efficiently if there was interoperability, for example, between one agency and another.
Yes.
We don't have that. Even across the region, there are things that we are doing that we could do better if we had a regional approach. And that could easily be facilitated if we had, digital connectivity between whatever agency. Just take national security, for example.
Right, yes.
People crossing the borders in the Caribbean. That's another example. Trade. So,
what are your thoughts on the single ICT space, looking at probably a platform through which regional connectivity can be fostered?
I think it's a good idea, but again, talking about a single ICT space, again, assumes that we can operate as if there are no borders.
Right.
Now, in a digital world, obviously, you can think about a single space, but at the same time, there's a lot that needs to be in place before that can even happen, right?
Understood.
Take one country, there is no single ICT space, even in a country like Jamaica, because every agency has its own siloed set of data and there's no interoperability. So how can you talk about a single ICT space in one country, let alone across borders? It's not to say that can't happen. It can't happen quickly with the right sort of mindset and leadership to get it done. But I don't see that as being one of these monumental challenges that the region faces. But I think we've got a lot of steps to get there.
Understood. So just before we continue with this IDB thrust, let's step back and tell us a little bit more about yourself and what do you do in your role as chairman.
What do I do?
Yes.
You really don't want to know. I was talking to Allison earlier. What do I do? So I manage. I have the privilege of managing these 6 countries in what's called the Caribbean Country Department of the IDB. You mentioned earlier that we also support through the CDB, the OECS countries. We don't have that many projects, but there's a major one on geothermal operating in some of those countries. But what we do is, what I do specifically is help provide strategic direction to the department and the work that goes on in each of the countries we work in. So the interesting part about the IDB is actually all of the countries own it. So there's Jamaica has a stake in the IDB, Guyana has a stake, Bahamas has a stake, Trinidad has a stake. So, through the board, they oversee the work that we do as staff. And the main work that we do is helping every single one of these countries solve their biggest development challenges. So if you were to talk about Jamaica, for example, what are the big challenges that this country faces? Crime and violence is one. Energy efficiency is another. Renewable energy, health issues. I mean, we cross many different sectors. So, and that is the same across the entire region. Some of the issues are different, but there are a lot of similarities in terms of the work.
Understood. And having been with the IDB for a few years, What has been your observations about ICT in the region and how it has evolved over?
So as I was saying earlier, I mean, I think we've got some basic infrastructure in place.
Mm-hmm.
But what the region lacks, to me, is a focus on how we can work differently. Mm-hmm. So we're living in a technological age where technology is changing at an exponential rate,
yes.
right? So think about the processing power of a microchip today versus 20 years ago. It's like mega times different. So what I can do on a cell phone today, remember, a smartphone today has about as much computing power as what NASA had when they launched the first spaceship to the moon, right? So that is a phenomenal development. Mm-hmm. But what do we use our smartphones for in the region?
Recreation of sorts.
Recreation, chatting, email. We don't really use it as a phone much. I mean, I don't. Mm-hmm. Most of my phone now is... Well, I use mine for other things like shopping and commerce and staying in touch with family. But around the world, people use their smartphones to do a lot of other things. Mm-hmm. In Estonia, for example, you can vote.
Yes.
From your phone. You can vote from your bed at home. You can vote from your laptop. You can pay your taxes online. You can check into your child's classroom online. Well, actually, I can do that too here in Jamaica because AISK actually has that. Something called Schoology, and we can check in real time. But that's not a common feature of every educational institution in Jamaica, right?
Yes.
So what we want to see is, and this is not just about efficiencies, but it's about connecting people in a different way to get things done in a more efficient way so that people can get on with their lives, right? Like, why do I want to, if I need to do a transaction with the government, stand in line for 30 minutes or hours or whatever? Or in a bank. Mm-hmm. Some people still go. I don't know why people go to banks. Why do people go to banks?
The sad thing is that there's still transactions that you have to do in person here in the region.
Yeah, yes. To open up a bank account, you have to present yourself. That's part of the know your customer compliance regulations. But there are very few things now you need to actually go and stand in line to buy for. Mm-hmm. And hopefully in the coming years we'll see fewer and fewer bank branches anyway, and more fintech because people will be doing most of their banking from their smartphones. But I would say there are many opportunities we're missing out on technology because we don't have a very sophisticated ICT infrastructure across the region. Mm-hmm. If you think, let's take agriculture. Mm-hmm. In the Caribbean, agriculture is still being done the old-fashioned way. Old men on farms, relying on their brawn, not necessarily their intellect, right? To figure out when to plant, what to plant, and so on. And still relying on extension services from the Ministry of Agriculture, right?
Yes.
In sophisticated countries that are using what I call smart agriculture, and I'm not saying this in any derogatory way, by the way, but there are other ways to do it. Yes. So it's very much based on data and information. When is the right time to plant? And I'm not saying that doesn't happen with farmers here in St. Thomas or anywhere in Jamaica or anywhere in this region. But for the most part, I know it's not happening because we have the analysis to show that there is not much technology being used in agriculture in the region. And if you think about the threat of climate change and what we need to be doing with agriculture, it really needs to be smart. And that means we need to use more data, we need to use more technology to figure out where we grow these crops, under what conditions we grow these crops. Right. And it may not necessarily mean that these crops are being grown in soil anymore, because now you can grow things in warehouses and in containers and using very sophisticated technology to get plants to grow in certain conditions. Yes. So it's a science.
Definitely.
Right? And that could help us build resilience in agriculture. But we're not seeing much of that happen in this region, but it's happening in other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. So, are there any specific opportunities you believe we in the region are not taking advantage of?
Specific opportunities? Well, I think renewable energy may be one that we're catching on to very slowly because we've been working, the IDP's been working in the Caribbean to get all of these countries to think about the diversification of their energy, let's call it ecosystem, right?
Right,
so
yes.
for the most part, we're still very much heavily reliant on heavy fuel oils. We haven't moved very far on renewables. Some great targets have been set, ambitious ones in some countries, to get more use of renewable energy, whether it's wind or solar or something else, thermal energy. So I think that's a big one. And if you think about the implications of that, reducing the electricity costs, making manufacturing, making everything more competitive and less expensive, that translates to tourism, that translates into other things. So that's a big opportunity that remains to be exploited. The whole area of a digital transformation remains an agenda that's only a little bit advancing and not going very fast.
Definitely.
So yeah, those are two big areas I would highlight.
Yeah, because I think we have been just hearing about digital transformation for years now, and I think we're still in the talking stage.
Some countries are moving a little faster than others. So Jamaica wanted to start with a national ID, right? Which is almost like a prerequisite for doing it, I think, in a very systematic and orderly way, because without a digital ID, it's very difficult to do transactions online and to authenticate whether Allison is really Allison or Joshua is Joshua or Therese is Therese. You have to have a way to prove that, right? So you need to start with having a digital identity. And that sounds scary to some people because some people think, all right, what about fraud? What about cybersecurity and all? But it can be done in a way that privacy is protected, identity is protected, and actually people will be liberated to do more higher value things than having to always present yourself with a driver's license or passport or whatever form of identification they have. But that's really important. That's one piece. The other piece is the whole issue of digitizing records, right? So if you think about health records, in many countries in this region, we are a long way away from having digital records. So my doctor can't go online and figure out if I'm in Jamaica, but I happen to fall sick in Bahamas. If I don't have a physical copy of my records, it's really difficult to get that information across. So generally, doctors will have to call each other on the phone and that kind of thing. But imagine if across this region, we could transfer those files seamlessly. So if I get sick in the Bahamas, but I'm somewhere else, the record is there. And the same for, in a physical space like Jamaica, you can be in Falmouth, but you need to be treated at UWI Hospital.
Exactly.
And that doctor at UWI Hospital can be treating you in Falmouth through some internet connection, some web-based way of connecting. So, there's so many applications that are out there and we're not using. And it also presents opportunities for the private sector. So while we talked about the fact that we don't have many engineers or systems people or software writers, there are, we know, because you know this from the space you're working in at UWI or UTech, there are people who are developing apps, applications to solve problems that can be sold in the marketplace. And this is what a digital agenda would generally do. People who have those skills all of a sudden find that there's a market for their skills to develop these applications to help, whether it's the government or the private sector or whomever, to come up with solutions.
Absolutely. And I do think, though, just going back to the whole issue of skills, there has to be a sense of a demand for some skills such that the supply, to drive the supply, because I do think that currently we have people, for example, who are coming out of universities in the region as software developers, programmers, engineers, but they can't find work in those areas. So, you do the next best thing, whatever that might be.
It drives migration.
Exactly.
Outward migration, yeah. I mean, I think the demand for those skills is building. I see it building in Jamaica. It's building in Trinidad. It's building in Barbados. It's building in the Bahamas. Because I think in these countries in particular, the government has made some explicit statements about wanting to become a digital economy.
Yes.
I mean, you heard the Prime Minister say this about 3 years ago, and so he's been on this trajectory for a long time. But you need to have a high-level policy commitment to it.
Yes.
And that will drive the supply of services that need to come along with it, right? So all of a sudden, people who have these skills will realize, oh, well, all right, if the government's going in that direction, they're going to need these skills, and I have them, and so let me find ways to sell those skills to the government or whomever, the private sector. So I think there is a lot of I have a lot of optimism on this topic, just because if the region doesn't adjust faster to technology and innovation, we're not going to be able to compete at many, many levels, no matter what it is that we're doing, even if it's tourism or agriculture or education. It's a train that's coming very fast at us. And by the way, I mean, if you're under 30, I would say, there's a way of being in the world that you only know that's web-based or you have a smartphone, right?
Yes.
I don't imagine that my 15-year-old daughter has a notion that she would have to go into a bank to do a transaction. That's just not in her mindset.
Exactly.
Her mindset is, well, I have mommy's credit card on my Apple Pay, and so if I need to use it, I just can swipe my phone, right? So,
exactly.
And then I have, there are smaller kids who have grown up on the iPad and so on. And so I think the average Caribbean citizen 10, 20 years from now, this won't be an issue. We won't be discussing this because it's going to be the reality of how we work.
Understood. But as much as we know that digital transformation is a priority, some countries have expressed it, we probably are not moving fast enough, as you said. What do you think is holding the region back, though?
I mean, part of it is leadership on the topic. Part of it is mindset.
Right.
And the other part of it is a lack of investment in the ICT. We've left ICT basically to private sector to develop, whether it's cable and wireless or whomever. Not that it's not government's role to provide those services, but the policy has to be in place to make sure that ICT companies would continue to be interested in this region. So I keep talking about 5G as a potential way of bringing this whole ICT space you're talking about. And when I talk to the providers, oh, no, it's too expensive. We don't have the scale in the Caribbean. But the whole idea of 5G is, for the future, is because the Internet of Things is going to become a bigger and bigger reality, and people only think of the Internet of Things as
home automation or something.
Yeah, Samsung refrigerator, that famous ad that you see on TV, which is a cool one, but that's just one example of how you can connect things, right?
Yes.
My phone can tell me what I have in my fridge, but that's just, that's a consumer example. But there's so many other ways, if you think about traffic flow and the fact that we don't have a way of knowing traffic in real time so that people can divert their journeys, as one example. So if we had connected devices that were connected to the traffic lights, then we would know which roads to avoid. So that's, that's a better example, because how many fatalities are there in this country, road fatalities every year? It's a large number. It's a large number in many places.
Yes.
And maybe that can help. So there are all kinds of ways, I think, that this agenda is going to get pushed, not just by consumers, but by, what's happening globally.
Understood. And are there any specific initiatives or activities that the IDB is currently supporting in regard to fostering ICT development in the region?
So we have a lot of, I talked about the research part of the bank.
Yes.
And lots of studies sort of analyzing what's needed. What's the diagnosis of readiness?
Yes.
And so we have that information. So it's convincing governments that, look, you're lagging behind, so let's move on it. Guyana, Bahamas, Jamaica, and Barbados are moving towards digital ID and digitizing government.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thrust to be a digital economy. And, what does that mean? That means having in place, if you take the Estonian example from Estonia, having in place a mechanism where every part of the government speaks to each other
Mm-hmm.
through a common portal that is accessible using a digital ID.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that if I enter it as a doctor, for example, trying to check on the records of one of my patients, it doesn't mean that just because as the doctor entering the information that I can see all of your information, my patient's information.
Mm-hmm.
I only get to see what I'm allowed to see.
Exactly.
Right? And I think this is another common perception. Well, the government has all of my information. No. And, not all of that, the storage of the data, it's controlled through this one pathway, but it doesn't mean that the solutions are owned by the government, right? So that's where the private sector comes in,
right?
Because there are developers who would know how to do things much better than the government does. So I think that's, if these countries were to move very quickly, then we'll see
Mm-hmm.
These projects come to life, and I'm sure we'll see more economies being transformed very quickly in the region.
So in terms of probably projects and initiatives that are directed towards the private sector or individuals, what you have any of those that the bank might be doing, specifically in relation to ICT?
ICT.
Yeah.
So IDB Lab, which is the piece I talked about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
we're experimenting with blockchain technology
Right.
in agriculture. So think about tracing a product from a farm to the retailer.
Mm-hmm.
Companies now like Walmart and other big grocery stores in the US need to find out if a tomato that gets contaminated, where does that tomato come from, right? So we have something similar going on in a couple of countries around the region, not in the Caribbean yet, but this is a new thing that they're developing. That's one solution. We're using blockchain to do educational certificates in the Bahamas, also here with the global services project that we're doing in Jamaica.
Right.
CXE
Right.
Council
Yes.
will be using blockchain to issue certificates. So, right now when you graduate from university or high school or whatever, you got a piece of paper at the end that your parent may frame and hang on the wall. And 20 years later, when you need to say, well, I did go to this school and I graduated in that year,
Mm-hmm.
then you have to take it out of the frame and copy it. Or you call back to your university to write them and they send you a copy of their certificate. A blockchain certificate is something that can be downloaded to a phone or a laptop or something, and then you have it as a lifetime certificate, right?
Yes,
So they're calling those block certs. So that's one way of getting around this whole paper-based
Mm-hmm.
world that we have now with certificates, right? And it also authenticates, because we know that they're quite a lot of fraudulent certificates hanging in people's offices about where they went to school and maybe they didn't go there and they didn't graduate. But this is one way to just authenticate, but also have it easily accessible and less cumbersome than the way we're used to having certificates.
Right.
So those are two really good ones, I think.
And I say if, granted that I'm sure that you do it as part of your role, if you had to advise Caribbean leaders on priorities that should be adopted to accelerate ICT in the region, what might those be?
Well, first of all, I think they need to articulate a policy around the digital agenda and what that means. I think for every country has to come up with its own definition. So whether it's through a national ID, whether it's through, some people are saying, why not have a Caribbean ID? Why are we thinking about just a national ID? Can this be rolled out across the region? I would say because this region has not been very good at coming to common solutions quickly.
Yes.
I won't wait for the regional solution. I'd rather go ahead with a national one. And, because it's a digital identity, it's not that difficult to roll it out to the region elsewhere if other people want to adopt it. But it means having proper legislation in place. As you know, the Jamaica national ID, the original law has been struck down as unconstitutional, so it's important to have the proper legislation governing this framework. And it also needs to be a discussion that people are having in their countries. It's not just about what works in one country and saying it's going to work very well in another country. Despite all of our common heritage and our common needs as human beings, at the end of the day, every country is different and every country is going to want to put their own spin on it.
Right.
But I think it starts with policy statements. It starts with having the right policies in place, with nurturing the educational environments, making sure we are producing engineers, people who know how to write software and code, and who can support sophisticated ICT systems, and just always thinking ahead. I mean, looking at the future, not just looking. I think we tend to project the future based on the past, but that's not a very good way of looking at things.
And certainly
we have to anticipate the future because, for example, we know that climate change is going to present a very different reality for the Caribbean soon, especially if nothing changes. And the way the whole global discussion is going, it's very difficult to see how there are going to be dramatic shifts. We know the climate is changing, and how are we preparing for that? So I think climate change is one really important lens to look at every single development challenge in the Caribbean right now.
Right.
And then if you add technology as the other piece, then you can see how these two can work together to help solve some of our big problems. So my big advice is getting the policies right, setting them, articulating the vision. You know, we're going to be a digital economy. I think that's a really good vision. And then putting in place the policies to get that done and making sure that we are preparing for the future and not looking back to say, well, you know, in 1970 we grew by 6%. Well, it's not 1970 anymore. It's 2019 and the world is very different, and the way we produce is different, the way human beings behave is different, the way technology interacts with us is different. The way people are going to be working in the future is going to be different. So a lot of the jobs that we currently know will not exist anymore because of technology. And how do you adjust society to that change that's coming very rapidly in us, right? So people talk about artificial intelligence as if it's something really weird. Well, it's not. We're already using it.
Yes.
Siri is on our phones, and chat boxes are popping up when we go online shopping. That's artificial intelligence. Decisions are being made in banks based on algorithms, which is artificial intelligence. So, I mean, there's a lot of it that's already in our ecosystem and the way we live, but we don't call it that, right?
Yes,
it's not robots. It's it's software, and you know, it's not a scary thing. We just have to learn how to adapt to it.
And on that note, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It was just lovely to have you, and I'm sure that our listeners will at least better appreciate what the IDV does, but also I think the insights that you shared, I think, would be food for thought for many.
Good. I hope so. And because the conversation really has to be broadened in the Caribbean context. I think we tend not to find ourselves in the center of some of these discussions when we really ought to be in the center of these discussions because they affect us.
Definitely.
So yeah, and hopefully I inspire someone to think about not doing law, but doing technology or ICT or engineering, because I think that's the future. But at the same time, I'm also confident that, you know, with our creativity and with the way Caribbean people have a lot of imagination, that we come up with our own solutions that are creative and they solve the problems we have.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ICT-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.